In the late summer of 1944, somewhere along a command wire stretched across the scorched plains of central France, a Wehrmacht field officer sat down and did something unusual. He did not write a battle report. He did not file a casualty estimate. He wrote, instead, a character study, a psychological and operational audit of a single American general whose army had just torn a hole in the German defensive lines so wide and so fast that the officer's own division, a proud, veteran outfit that had held the Ostfront for 2 winters, had simply ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force in 72 hours. The officer's name has been largely lost to the administrative fog of a collapsing war, but the summary he produced was not lost. It filtered up through Army Group G, reached OKW, and contributed to a body of frontline intelligence that the German High Command found simultaneously invaluable and utterly useless, because by the time the summary was written, actioned, and filed, the man it described had already moved 60 miles further east. That was the kinetic reality of fighting George S. Patten, Jr. You understood him in the rearview mirror, always. The Germans learned this repeatedly, expensively, and too late. To conduct a proper strategic audit of Patten, you must first understand what the German military believed about American generalship before they encountered it in any serious sustained form, and what they believed, with the institutional confidence of a military culture that had rewritten the tactical manual of the 20th century in less than 4 years, was that American officers were administratively competent but operationally timid. The assessment was not entirely without basis. The campaigns in North Africa through 1942 had given them data points. The debacle at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, where green American troops and hesitant senior commanders had handed Rommel a clean tactical victory, seemed to confirm the Wehrmacht's working hypothesis. American industrial capacity, they acknowledged, was a problem, a serious logistical problem. But American generalship, that, they believed, was manageable. It could be bled, it could be stalled, it could be outthought by professional soldiers who had been practicing the art of mobile armored warfare since the Polish campaign of 1939. This was the myth. This was the opening error in the German calculus, and it was precisely the kind of error that a thorough strategic audit is designed to locate. Because the German assessment of American generalship, while not entirely wrong in 1942, was catastrophically wrong about one specific American, and they had encountered him before they fully processed the implications. George Patten did not emerge from a theoretical vacuum. He arrived in North Africa in November 1942 as commander of the Western Task Force for Operation Torch, and the logistical machinery he ran ashore at Casablanca was itself a statement of industrial intent. But the Germans were not yet studying him at the operational level with the urgency the situation would soon demand, because the American effort in Tunisia through the winter of 1942 into 1943 was, by any forensic measure, uneven. Kasserine was a legitimate embarrassment. It is important to state that plainly, without apologia. The Second Corps that broke at Kasserine was a formation that had not yet been stress-tested in the manner that all formations must eventually be stress-tested, which is to say by the application of determined, experienced violence against the seam of their preparation. Rommel found the seam. He drove through it. The math of that engagement was not favorable to American arms. And then, on March 6, 1943, Eisenhower replaced the Second Corps commander, Lloyd Fredendall, with Patten. The German High Command noted the change. They did not yet fully understand what the change meant. What followed over the next 26 days was the opening chapter of a strategic audit that the Wehrmacht would be conducting under increasingly desperate circumstances for the next 2 years. Patten took a formation that had been operationally shaken, imposed on it a brutal and non-negotiable standard of physical discipline, professionalism, and tactical aggression, and then drove it into the Axis lines with a forward momentum that began to seriously complicate German logistics in the southern sector of the Tunisian front. He did not achieve miracles. It would be analytically dishonest to claim he did. But he changed the psychological temperature of the Second Corps measurably, quickly, in a way that German frontline observers noted in their unit diaries. The American soldier, one such diary entry recorded with a trace of professional surprise, was no longer advancing hesitantly. The word in the original German is closer to tentatively. He was no longer advancing tentatively. That is the moment where the German strategic audit of Patten should have begun in earnest. It did not. The Tunisian campaign ended in May 1943 with the surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops, and the Germans, naturally, had other institutional priorities than the careful forensic study of the American general who had contributed to that outcome. They were, after all, simultaneously managing a deteriorating situation on the Ostfront, the growing Allied bombing campaign against the German industrial base, and the diplomatic reality of a war whose original assumptions about duration and outcome were beginning to decompose at the margins. Patten, meanwhile, was planning Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, was the engagement that should have forced a complete rewrite of the German operational assessment of American armored doctrine. It largely did not, for reasons that themselves constitute a ballistic anomaly in the broader history of the Wehrmacht's institutional intelligence apparatus, an apparatus that was, in most respects, genuinely sophisticated. Husky should have been a clarifying event because what Patten demonstrated in Sicily was not simply tactical competence. What he demonstrated was something that the German military, for all its technical and doctrinal brilliance, found structurally difficult to replicate by the summer of 1943, which was operational tempo sustained by a logistical lung deep enough to keep it breathing. The concept of logistical lung is not complicated, but it is frequently underweighted in popular histories of the Second World War because logistics lacks the dramatic visual vocabulary of a tank engagement or an infantry assault. But logistics is the circulatory system of any military campaign, and the depth of that system, the distance it can sustain forward momentum before the formation begins to starve, is the single most reliable predictor of operational reach. The German military, particularly in the armored formations that had defined their early war dominance, ran on a logistical lung that was, by 1943, showing serious structural strain. Fuel, replacement parts, artillery shells. The Ostfront was consuming German industrial output at a rate that the Reich's production base, for all its genuine formidability, was struggling to offset. The logistical lung was tightening. The American logistical lung, by contrast, was just beginning to fully inflate. The numbers coming out of American industrial production by mid-1943 are not numbers that lend themselves to casual recitation. They require stillness. They require the kind of deliberate attention that an auditor gives to a balance sheet that has just revealed something structurally conclusive about a company's competitive position. In 1943 alone, American factories produced approximately 29,000 tanks. The entire German tank production for that same year, including light vehicles, assault guns, and tank destroyers, was roughly 12,000 units. And unlike the German production figures, which were increasingly complicated by Allied strategic bombing, material shortages, and the organizational inefficiencies of a war economy that had never fully rationalized its industrial planning, American production was accelerating. The curve was going one direction. The gap was not closing, it was widening, month by month, with the mechanical indifference of a factory floor that had been running 3 shifts since 1942 and had not yet approached its operational ceiling. Patten understood this math at an almost cellular level. He had studied armor since before most of the German panzer commanders who would eventually face him had been assigned to the branch. He had been at the 1st Tank Brigade at Langres during the First World War. He had written theoretical doctrine on armored warfare in the 1920s and 1930s, when the American military establishment considered such work eccentric, premature, and professionally unwise to be associated with too strongly.
He had sat with that doctrine through the lean years and the budget cuts and the institutional skepticism, and when the war finally arrived and the industrial machinery finally began to produce what the doctrine required, he was, in the precise sense of the phrase, the man who had been waiting for the material. In Sicily, that combination of prepared doctrine and arriving material produced something the German defenders found genuinely disorienting: the pace, the relentless, grinding, seemingly irrational pace of Patten's 7th Army advance. When the Allied invasion began on July 10, 1943, the operational plan had assigned the British 8th Army under Montgomery the primary axis of advance, the eastern coastal route toward Messina. Patten's 7th Army was tasked with the secondary mission, essentially serving as a flank guard for Montgomery's advance. It was a supporting role. It was a logistical and doctrinal insult to a man who had spent 20 years thinking about nothing but offensive armor operations, and Patten treated it as such. What followed is described in the operational records of the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the Hermann Göring Division with a quality of professional bewilderment that is, forensically speaking, quite revealing. Patten did not guard Montgomery's flank. Patten used the latitude of his secondary mission to launch a secondary offensive of his own, swinging his armor northwest toward Palermo in a drive that covered roughly 100 miles in less than 4 days. The German and Italian defenders in that sector had been oriented toward the anticipated British axis of advance. They were not positioned, not supplied, and not psychologically prepared for an armored column moving at that speed from that direction. Palermo fell on July 22nd. The strategic implications were immediate. Patten now controlled the western half of the island and could redirect his axis of advance eastward toward Messina, which meant the Allied race for the island's northeastern tip had, suddenly and without Eisenhower's explicit authorization, become a competitive event. The German frontline assessment of this episode was pointed. One staff officer attached to the 14th Panzer Corps characterized the American armored advance as demonstrating an operational audacity that was, in his framing, inconsistent with the American tactical performance the Wehrmacht had observed up to that point in the war. This is a remarkable sentence when you hold it up to the light. It reveals the precise texture of the German miscalculation. They had constructed an image of American generalship from the data points available to them: North Africa, early Tunisia, the institutional caution they perceived in Eisenhower's methodical planning architecture, and Patten was producing outputs that didn't match the model. The model was wrong. The German command structure did not fully process this in time to make the model's revision operationally useful. Patten beat Montgomery to Messina on August 17, 1943. The race itself was of limited strategic value, since the bulk of the Axis forces had already conducted a disciplined evacuation across the Strait of Messina. But the race's psychological architecture was significant in ways that would matter enormously over the following 12 months. Because the man who had outrun the British 8th Army in Sicily was now one of the most studied subjects in German military intelligence, and the study was producing conclusions that the High Command found strategically inconvenient. This particular American general did not appear to share the operational timidity that the Wehrmacht's working model of American generalship had predicted. He operated as if the logistical lung behind him was inexhaustible, because in any meaningful comparative sense, it was. The slapping incidents of August 1943 represent one of the most consequential accidents of strategic deception in the Second World War, and they were not designed as such, which makes them all the more instructive as a case study in kinetic reality intersecting with command psychology. When Patten struck 2 shell-shocked soldiers in evacuation hospitals in Sicily, a behavior that was, to be direct about it, professionally indefensible and humanly inexcusable, the resulting public controversy in the United States led Eisenhower to sideline him for nearly a year. Patten would not command a field army in combat again until August 1944, when the Third Army became operational in France. That 11-month gap was, from the German perspective, a period of genuine relief. Their intelligence assessments noted his removal from active command with the kind of institutional satisfaction that military staffs permit themselves when a problem appears to have resolved itself through the enemy's own actions. But the Allied command structure, with a sophistication that deserves its own strategic audit, proceeded to weaponize Patten's notoriety in a manner that the Germans, despite their genuinely competent intelligence apparatus, could not adequately counter. Operation Fortitude, the strategic deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the primary Allied invasion of France would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, had many components. Its most credible component, the component that gave German intelligence officers sitting in their analytical cells the most rational reason to keep significant panzer reserves east of the Seine in the weeks after D-Day, was the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, and its notional commander, who was George Patten. The logic was sound, and it was sound precisely because the German assessment of Patten, despite all its failures and delays, had, by the spring of 1944, arrived at one correct conclusion. He was the most dangerous American operational commander in the theater. He was the one most capable of leading a major armored exploitation following an amphibious landing. If FUSAG existed, and if Patten commanded it, then the Pas-de-Calais was a legitimate invasion threat. This conclusion, drawn from 2 years of painful and expensive field research against Patten's actual operational record, became the instrument of German strategic paralysis in the critical weeks after June 6, 1944. The Germans had finally understood Patten well enough to be effectively deceived by the use of his reputation as a weapon. The real Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944. Within 72 hours of assuming command, Patten had his armor through the Avranches Gap and was fanning out across Brittany and into the interior of France at a pace that the German 7th Army's logistical infrastructure, already stretched to the point of structural failure, had no coherent answer for.
The delayed realization had arrived, and it had arrived at precisely the worst possible moment for the Wehrmacht, which is to say, the moment when the German army in France had the least capacity to do anything about it. The Lorraine campaign of September and October 1944 is where the strategic audit of Patten becomes genuinely complex, because it is where the forensic record requires intellectual honesty about the limits of even the most gifted operational commander when the logistical lung behind him collapses. And collapse is not too strong a word for what happened to Allied supply lines in the early autumn of 1944. The breakout from Normandy had been so fast, so operationally violent in its forward momentum, that the entire Allied logistical architecture, built around the assumption of a more methodical advance, had been left structurally behind. Fuel, ammunition, replacement parts for Sherman tanks whose high-mileage road wheels were grinding themselves to failure on the French road network. The Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy system that ran supplies 24 hours a day across the French interior, was a genuine feat of American organizational improvisation. But it was running at the outer boundary of its physical capacity, and the simple arithmetic of the situation was unforgiving. The Third Army was consuming approximately 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day during active offensive operations. The pipeline could not sustain that number indefinitely across a front that had moved several hundred miles east of its supply ports in less than 2 months. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, the decision to advance on multiple axes simultaneously rather than concentrate all available supply behind a single narrow thrust, has been debated by military historians since the autumn of 1944, and it will likely continue to be debated. Patten's own position on the matter was unambiguous, characteristically profane, and not entirely without operational merit. He believed that a concentrated allocation of fuel and supply to the Third Army in September 1944 would have allowed him to drive through the Siegfried Line before the Germans had adequately reconstituted their defensive positions. The Germans, for what it is worth, largely agreed with this assessment after the war.
Several senior Wehrmacht officers in post-war interrogations stated that the German defensive line in the West Wall was, in September 1944, a scaffolding rather than a fortification, held together by organizational habit, a handful of veteran formations, and the Allied logistical pause that gave them the time they needed to make the scaffold into something sturdier. But the fuel did not come, and Patten's Third Army ground to a strategic halt in front of the Moselle River that would have consequences measured in months and in lives. The Lorraine campaign that followed was attritional, grinding, fought in autumn mud that turned the terrain into a logistical punishment and negated much of the armored mobility that had defined the Third Army's operational identity through August and into September. The German Ardennes offensive, what American veterans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, was in its conception a genuine operational gamble, and in its execution a demonstration of what a professional military machine can achieve when it accepts catastrophic risk in the service of one final strategic throw. 20 German divisions, including several of the reconstituted SS Panzer formations that constituted the remaining offensive fist of the Wehrmacht in the West, drove through thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg and created a penetration roughly 50 miles wide and 60 miles deep at its maximum extent. The First Army's command architecture in the northern sector of the penetration was genuinely disrupted. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 entire regiments to encirclement on the Schneeifel in one of the most numerically significant American surrenders of the European War. Bastogne, the critical road junction in the southern shoulder of the Bulge, was surrounded. The weather had grounded Allied air support. The situation, viewed honestly from the maps in SHAEF headquarters on December 18th, was the most serious crisis the Allied command had faced since the Normandy breakout had begun. Eisenhower convened a conference at Verdun on December 19th. The attendance roster included Bradley, Devers, Tedder, and Patten. Eisenhower asked when Patten could disengage the Third Army from its ongoing offensive in the Saar, reorient 90 degrees to the north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration to relieve Bastogne. The room, by most accounts of those present, expected an answer measured in weeks. The logistical and organizational mechanics of disengaging a field army from active combat, rotating its axis of advance by 90 degrees across winter roads in the Ardennes, and launching a coherent offensive attack were understood by every professional soldier in that room to represent a genuinely difficult operational problem. Patten said he could attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions. The silence that followed that statement is one of the most documented moments in American military history, and it deserves the forensic attention the documentary record gives it, because the silence was not the silence of men who doubted him. It was the silence of men who understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that they were in the presence of something that the professional military culture of their generation did not have fully adequate vocabulary to describe. Because Patten had not made that calculation at the Verdun conference, he had made it 72 hours earlier, when his own intelligence staff had begun tracking the buildup indicators in the Ardennes that suggested a German offensive was coming. He had already quietly ordered his staff to begin the preliminary planning for exactly this contingency. The attack he offered Eisenhower on December 19th was not improvised. It was drawn from a plan that had been constructed, in Patten's characteristic manner, ahead of the moment that would require it. The Third Army's attack began on December 22nd. It relieved Bastogne on December 26th. The German High Command's operational summary for that period noted, with the exhausted precision of men who had been studying this particular problem for 2 years, that the American Third Army's rate of advance through winter terrain under active enemy pressure was inconsistent with what standard doctrine held to be operationally achievable. Inconsistent with doctrine. That phrase, appearing in a Wehrmacht operational summary in the final winter of the Third Reich, is the closing entry in the German strategic audit of George Patten. After 2 years of field research, of unit diaries and intelligence summaries and prisoner interrogations and post-mortem analyses of engagements that had gone wrong in the particular signature manner that engagements against Patten tended to go wrong, the Wehrmacht's professional assessment had arrived at the forensic equivalent of an open verdict. This man was operating by a different set of internal parameters than the ones they had built their defensive planning around, and they had never successfully adjusted their model to account for him. The Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, one day before Montgomery's meticulously planned and heavily resourced crossing to the north, and did so without the elaborate preparatory artillery and engineering architecture that mainstream doctrine held to be necessary for such an operation. Patten reportedly called Eisenhower from the eastern bank to report the crossing, and his choice of words, stripped of the profanity that surrounded them, contained the essential summary of his entire operational philosophy. He had bounced the river. He had moved faster than the defense could orient itself to what was happening. Speed was not a byproduct of his method. Speed was the weapon. By the time German forces surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Third Army had liberated or captured approximately 81,500 square miles of territory, processed over 1.2 million prisoners of war, and in its 11 months of continuous combat operations had advanced further and faster against a defending enemy than any army in the history of the Western Front, in either World War. The industrial mathematics behind those numbers are not incidental to the achievement. The Sherman tanks, the jeeps, the fuel cans, the artillery shells, the replacement boots and winter gear that American factories had been producing around the clock since 1942 were the physical substrate without which Patten's operational vision remained theoretical. He understood that. He acknowledged it when he acknowledged anything about the machinery behind him, with the directness of a man who had studied logistics as seriously as he had studied tactics. But the machinery required the man, and the man required the machinery, and in the particular alignment of American industrial capacity with American operational audacity that defined the Third Army's campaign from Avranches to the Czechoslovakian border, the United States produced something that its enemies, in their thorough and professional and ultimately futile attempts to audit it, never successfully reduced to a formula they could defend against. That was the kinetic reality. That was the logistical lung breathing at full capacity. That was the legacy, forged in factory smoke and diesel exhaust and the frozen mud of the Ardennes, that the Frontline summaries, filed in the dying language of a collapsing Reich, were still trying to explain when the lights finally went out.